March 15, 1944. In a quiet room deep within Japan's Naval Intelligence Headquarters, the faint hum of radio receivers filled the air like restless ghosts. Commander Atsuso Kurihara sat motionless, his third cup of tea untouched, its surface cooling beneath the dim, fluorescent light. Before him lay a sheet of transcribed code, an indecipherable stream of syllables and rhythm. For 18 hours, his team of Japan's finest cryptanalysts had strained to uncover its meaning. The sounds that whispered through their headphones were unlike anything they had encountered. Each transmission came in precise bursts, timed perfectly with American movements in the Marshall Islands. The rhythm matched Marine Corps tactical orders. Yet the words themselves, if they could be called words, were alien, defying every cipher, every linguistic pattern Kurihara knew. Besetti da Descartes. The phrase lingered in his mind. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, structured, alive. Kurihara commanded one of the most advanced intelligence networks in wartime Asia. The Aada communications unit, hidden 20 miles from Tokyo, was a hive of electrical activity. 500 personnel, 118 receivers, 20 direction finders sweeping the Pacific skies. These analysts had once pierced the secrets of nations. They had broken the State Department's Purple Code, intercepted British naval messages, even unraveled American diplomatic ciphers. Their successes had guided the Empire's victories at Pearl Harbor and beyond. But this was different. Every pattern, every algorithm collapsed into meaningless sound. It was as if the Americans had abandoned mathematics altogether and begun speaking in riddles no human outside their circle could comprehend. What Kurihara did not know, what no man in Japan could yet imagine, was that he was listening to a language that had never been conquered, not by war, not by empire, not by time itself. The story of this code began not on a battlefield, but in the ancient mesas and deserts of the American Southwest. There, long before nations and wars, a people spoke words shaped by wind and stone. The Navajo, or, as they called themselves, the Diné, the people. Their language, Diné Bizad, was a living labyrinth of sound and meaning. It belonged to the Athabascan family with roots stretching back thousands of years. By 1940, roughly 170,000 Navajos spoke it, most living across a vast reservation spanning Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Within that language lived centuries of memory, poetry, and complexity that no outsider had ever mastered completely. Unlike English or Japanese, Navajo revolved not around nouns but actions, verbs that transformed with prefixes and suffixes to express every nuance of motion, intent, and relationship. One verb could carry millions of variations, shaping time, tone, and emotion. 4 tones, high, low, rising, and falling, altered meaning entirely. A single misplaced pitch could turn horse into enemy, water into death. The very sounds of Navajo baffled foreign ears. Glottalized consonants, nasalized vowels, and abrupt stops that seemed more breath than speech. To Japanese analysts, trained in a language of 5 simple vowels, these sounds would be ungraspable, like trying to catch wind in a jar. Yet for centuries, the Navajo had kept their language alive through stories whispered by firelight, songs of creation and healing passed from generation to generation. It was their identity, their memory, and their power. And in 1942, that power was about to become America's most secret weapon. Philip Johnston understood this better than anyone. Born in 1892, the son of a Protestant missionary stationed on the Navajo reservation, Johnston grew up among the Diné. He spoke their language fluently, one of only a handful of outsiders who ever had. By age 9, he was already translating sermons for his father. At 15, he interpreted for Navajo leaders meeting President Theodore Roosevelt in Washington. When war returned to the Pacific, Johnston was living in California, an engineer by trade. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor, reading of military experiments using Native American languages for secure communications, Comanche in Louisiana, Choctaw in France during the Great War. Johnston recognized something no one else had. The Navajo language was perfect for modern encryption. It was completely unwritten. It was spoken only by Navajos. And to outsiders it was as impenetrable as smoke. On February 28, 1942, Johnston presented his idea to Major General Clayton Vogel of the U.S. Marine Corps at Camp Elliott near San Diego. Vogel, skeptical but curious, agreed to a demonstration. 4 Navajo men were brought in. They were given a set of English military messages, translated them into Navajo, transmitted them by radio, and then retranslated them back into English on the other end. It took them 20 seconds. The same message, encrypted through the Army's cipher machines, had taken 30 minutes. General Vogel didn't need further convincing. The Marines had found their code. Within weeks, 29 Navajo recruits were sworn in at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. Among them were Chester Nez, Lloyd Oliver, Carl Gorman, and John Benally, young men who had grown up herding sheep across sun-baked canyons or sitting in government schools where speaking Navajo meant punishment. Now, their language would be their greatest contribution to freedom. At Camp Elliott, they worked under lock and guard for 8 intense weeks. Their task was unlike any before it, to invent a code within their own language, a system that could translate the vast machinery of war into the living rhythm of Navajo speech. But how could a language that had no word for tank, battleship, or machine gun describe the tools of global warfare? Their solution was poetic. A submarine became Beshlo, the iron fish. A battleship became Lotso, the whale. Fighter planes were Tahiti High, hummingbirds. Bombers, Jay-Show, buzzards. The code took root in metaphor and nature, where every new word carried cultural logic and beauty. The alphabet, too, required layers of disguise. Each English letter would have multiple Navajo equivalents, chosen at random, destroying any predictable frequency. The letter E, for instance, could be elk, ear, axe, or apple. No codebook existed. Nothing was written down. They memorized every symbol, every phrase. To forget was to fail, and to fail could cost lives. As Chester Nez later remembered, we drilled endlessly. A mistake could kill men. Our language was sacred. Speaking it correctly was sacred. We had to treat it that way, even in war. When the first Navajo code talkers landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they carried nothing but radios, courage, and their voices. The Japanese had already broken nearly every Allied code in the Pacific. They knew how to predict landings, trace movements, anticipate attacks. But suddenly, that advantage vanished. Across the jungle, Japanese intercept stations buzzed with confusion. The transmissions were clear, strong, and utterly incomprehensible. To Japanese ears, it wasn't English, wasn't Spanish, wasn't any known dialect of Asia or the Pacific. It was something else, something alive. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, one of Japan's brightest linguists and a Stanford graduate, listened for days, convinced that with enough analysis the mystery would yield. But it never did. He wrote later in his report, "The sounds are structured like language with rhythm and pattern, yet it matches nothing. It is completely alien." The empire's cryptographers turned to monks, scholars, even ethnologists who had studied Native Americans before the war. None could identify it. The syllables had form but no meaning. The logic was invisible. And as the Japanese struggled to understand, the Marines gained an advantage that could not be measured in machines or guns, an advantage born from the human voice, from a culture that had endured centuries of silence and suppression. In the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, the first unbreakable code in modern military history had spoken its first words. In the humid dawn of Guadalcanal, the jungle trembled beneath the weight of war. The cries of parrots mingled with the thunder of artillery. Amid the chaos, a young Marine crouched beside a radio set, his voice calm, measured, and steady. Nash Deutzo, Beshlo, Ahi. Bear, iron fish, thank you. His message, spoken in the cadence of ancient songs, traveled through the static, across the waves, and into the ears of another Navajo half a mile away. Within seconds, it became a command for artillery fire. The Japanese positions that had pinned down an entire company vanished beneath explosions moments later. What took the enemy days to plan was undone in seconds, because they could not understand the voices that carried death between syllables of beauty. At Japan's 8th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul, officers listened in disbelief. Recordings of these messages filled their rooms, captured on spinning reels and wax cylinders. They charted frequencies, counted intervals, mapped every signal on paper. Patterns emerged, message lengths, pauses, repetitions. But meaning remained hidden, as though the language itself resisted invasion. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, the same scholar who had studied in America before the war, wrote in frustration, "It is clearly structured, yet it yields nothing. The sounds flow like water. Each phrase seems part of something living, something breathing. It cannot be reduced to code. By the end of 1942, hundreds of hours of transmissions had been recorded. None were deciphered. Japanese analysts, linguists, and even Buddhist monks versed in ancient Sanskrit labored in vain. The empire that had broken British and American military ciphers now faced something it could not quantify. For the Japanese, accustomed to the precision of mathematics and language rooted in shared culture, this was more than failure. It was humiliation. Their enemy had weaponized something human, something no machine could calculate. And at the center of that mystery stood the Navajo code talkers. One of them, Chester Nez, would later recall how unreal it felt. "We were just boys from the desert. We never thought our language would decide battles." Yet, battle after battle, their voices shaped victory. When the Marines stormed Guadalcanal, 15 code talkers landed with the 1st Marine Division. The Japanese, expecting to intercept every move as they had done before, found silence where there should have been clarity. Their eavesdroppers grew frantic. At Rabaul, Colonel Haruo Konuma, head of intelligence for the 17th Army, wired Tokyo. "The Americans have created a code that defeats every attempt. We no longer anticipate their attacks. We are fighting blind." But the Japanese still believed the answer lay somewhere within reach, perhaps hidden among prisoners. In April 1942, before the code was even born, a Navajo soldier named Joe Kiyumiya had been captured in Bataan. Fluent in Navajo and English, he became Japan's great hope. When the intercepted transmissions reached intelligence units, Kiyumiya was brought to a small room in the Aada interrogation center. There, Japanese officers played recordings of the mysterious language. To their astonishment, he recognized the words, but not their meaning. The turtle is attacking the iron fish. The hummingbird carries eggs. Phrases that sounded like children's riddles, but to the trained ear of a code talker, they meant tanks advancing, bombers en route, coordinates for fire. When Kiyumiya failed to translate them, his captors refused to believe him. What followed was cruelty beyond comprehension. Torture, starvation, freezing exposure, each day an attempt to break his will or extract the secret. But there was no secret to give. In May 1943, Japanese intelligence finally reported, "The prisoner appears native to the mystery language but cannot comprehend messages." Assessment: either extraordinary resistance or enemy employs specialized code within native tongue requiring military training. It was the second conclusion that was true. Even to a fluent speaker, the Navajo code was incomprehensible without training. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was proof of concept. Their Unbreakable code worked flawlessly. Every message was accurate, immediate, and secure. Major General Alexander Vandegrift wrote, "The Navajo communicators have proven invaluable. Their transmissions are faster than any encoding device and absolutely secure." The Marine Corps immediately expanded the program. At Camp Pendleton in California, a new training school was built. Navajo recruits arrived from across the vast reservation: farmers, shepherds, students, each carrying a secret that would soon become one of the most powerful weapons of the Pacific War. Training was relentless. Recruits learned military procedures, radio discipline, encryption, and battlefield survival. They practiced speaking through gas masks, transmitting while running, decoding under fire. They sent messages amid explosions played over speakers, their voices unwavering. One young trainee, Thomas B. Gay, recalled, "They made us run, then speak into the radio breathing hard, heart-pounding. We had to sound calm no matter what. Lives depended on our tone, our clarity, our words. No code books were allowed. Everything was committed to memory. Over time, the vocabulary grew. New words were born with each battle. Tank became Shedagahi, the tortoise. Machine gun, na alditso, the gun that shoots many times. Grenade, Nimasi, the potato. When the atomic bomb entered military planning, it was called Yeshi, the metal egg. Kamikaze pilots, those who flew to die, became Niti, the death wind. Every edition followed Navajo logic. To outsiders, it was gibberish. To the code talkers, it was poetry fused with precision. By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence had assigned 30 of its best cryptanalysts exclusively to these transmissions. Captain Yoshiro Tanaka led the team. He ordered musical analysis, charting tonal patterns like melodies. They slowed recordings, ran oscillographs, tried to match the tones to known American Indian languages. It was hopeless. Lieutenant Commander Masao Yamada later admitted, "We identified call signs, length correlations, message density, but not meaning. It was like studying bird songs without knowing what a bird is." The Japanese Army even offered bounties, 10,000 yen, nearly 10 years' salary, for the capture of a code talker or his radio intact. Marines soon learned to guard their communicators fiercely. If captured, orders were clear. No man was to fall alive with his code, but none ever did. Not one Navajo code talker was taken prisoner with their equipment. Their secrecy held through every island, every assault. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, the unbroken code carried commands that turned tides of war. At Tarawa in November 1943, 6 code talkers maintained communications for 76 hours of unrelenting combat. Lloyd Oliver transmitted continuously for 48 hours, coordinating naval gunfire so precisely that American shells fell within meters of Japanese bunkers. During the Marianas Campaign, 24 code talkers worked in shifts around the clock. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Harukawa, once confident in predicting Allied movements, now found his charts useless. His reports grew desperate. "We can no longer anticipate their landings. Their plans vanish into silence." For Japanese intelligence, the mystery became almost spiritual. Captain Tanaka later described it. The Americans used a living code, one that came from their blood, not from machines. We could not reach it. We could not even begin to think in its patterns. It was like trying to think the thoughts of another world. By the end of 1943, Japan's cryptographic divisions had effectively surrendered to the silence. They would record, observe, and archive, but not understand. The Americans had found something that no empire could break. A code not of numbers or rotors, but of culture, ancient, sacred, and alive. The war was far from over, but the sound of the Navajo language had already reshaped it. Where mathematics failed, humanity triumphed. And on battlefields across the Pacific, the voices of the Dene carried the rhythm of survival, the melody of an unbroken people. By early 1944, the Pacific War had turned. From the dense jungles of Guadalcanal to the coral atolls of Tarawa, American forces pressed forward with a new rhythm of communication, one born not from machines, but from the living voices of the Navajo. Each syllable that passed through the static carried more than orders. It carried the survival of men who had never met, bound together by a code only one people could speak. The Japanese, still determined to solve the enigma, intensified their efforts. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's Communication Analysis Bureau was ordered to devote all available linguists to the American tribal cipher, rooms filled with phonograph records, reels of captured broadcasts, and hastily written transcriptions. Every tone, every pause, every repetition was mapped. But each new message deepened the mystery. The analysts heard what sounded like music, a rhythm that shifted with purpose yet without pattern. It wasn't just language, it was a living system. Commander Masao Yamada, the same man who had studied in New Mexico years before, wrote in his final wartime report, "We realized too late that it was not a cipher, it was a culture. To understand it, one would need to live a lifetime inside it." By then, the tide of war was carrying that culture closer and closer to Japan itself. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. The dawn sky over the island turned black with the smoke of bombardment. On the decks of landing craft, young Marines waited in silence. The sea churned with gray ash and fire. Among them were 29 Navajo code talkers. Their mission: coordinate the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. As the ramps dropped, bullets struck the water like rain. Men disappeared beneath the surf before their boots even touched sand. Yet, amid the chaos, radios crackled to life. Nash doitso, bishlo, ta, hey. Bear, ironfish, on target. The Navajo voices cut through the gunfire like calm in a storm. Within minutes, artillery from offshore battleships adjusted their fire precisely where needed. Enemy pillboxes that had slaughtered hundreds were silenced. For 36 days, Iwo Jima became hell on earth. But the Navajo code talkers never stopped transmitting. One of them, Private First Class Joe Hosteen Kelwood, would later recall, "We sent over 800 messages in 2 days. Not one mistake, not one delay." At Mount Suribachi, when the famous flag was raised, a Navajo message confirmed it instantly across the Pacific. Nashjidi to abi hane do nihiji ta ajiltso. Hill secured. All units advancing. We are victorious. To American forces, it was triumph. To Japanese intelligence officers listening from bunkers in Chichijima and Okinawa, it was a death sentence written in an alien tongue. The intercepts were clear, the meaning forever lost. As the Empire's cryptographers stared at the meaningless strings of sound, many began to feel the weight of defeat. Captain Hiroshi Oshima, a naval code officer, noted in his diary, "They do not speak as soldiers. They speak as if singing. We cannot divide it. We cannot mimic it. Their voices are joined in something we do not possess." For the first time, the Japanese military, masters of discipline and precision, faced an enemy whose most powerful weapon came not from factories, but from the soul of a people. The burden of secrecy. Even as their voices carried victory, the code talkers lived in silence. They were forbidden to tell anyone, even their families, what they were doing. Letters home were censored, stripped of every clue. Many returned from the war without medals, without recognition, their stories sealed by military order. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, would later remember, "They told us never to speak of it. We went home to our sheep, our land, and no one knew what we'd done." The Navajo Nation had given its sons to a country that once tried to erase their language. Only decades earlier, boarding schools had punished children for speaking Navajo, washing their mouths with soap, forcing English at gunpoint. Now that same language had saved tens of thousands of American lives. The irony was not lost on them. Private Wilson Price once said quietly, "Our language was our punishment. Then it became our strength." Japanese intelligence. The final report. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the archives of its communication bureaus were seized by American intelligence. Inside, Allied officers found stacks of papers marked with the word Navajo. Charts, graphs, tone diagrams, all of them useless. Not a single translation, not a single sentence understood. A final note, written in Yamada's hand, read, "The Americans have created a code that cannot be broken. It is not because it is complex, but because it is alive." He was right. No code talker was ever captured. No transmission ever decoded. The Navajo Code remained the only unbroken code in modern military history. Aftermath. When the war ended, the code talkers returned home to silence and hardship. They were told their mission was classified. Their medals were locked away. They returned to their reservations, to sheep ranches, to empty land, to the same poverty they had left behind. But something inside them had changed. They had seen their words turn into power. Their songs had crossed oceans, carried the strength of their ancestors into the heart of battle. Years later, when secrecy was finally lifted, America began to learn their story. In 1968, their contribution was declassified. In 2001, the surviving code talkers received congressional gold medals. And at the Pentagon, a display now stands, a single Navajo radio, its headset resting like a relic of faith. But the true legacy cannot be measured in medals or monuments. It lives in every syllable still spoken by Navajo children today. A language once banned, now honored as a code that saved a nation. "The Japanese could break every machine," said Thomas Begay, his voice soft with age, "but they couldn't break our words. They couldn't break who we are." The jungle of Guadalcanal has long since reclaimed its silence. The radios are rusted, the bones buried. But if you listen closely through the static of time, you can still hear the rhythm of a voice calling across the Pacific. Calm, proud, and eternal. "Ah-ha-ha! Thank you." The guns of the Pacific had fallen silent. Across Japan, the once unbreakable empire lay in ruins. Cities burned to ash, ships rusted in their harbors, and from the shattered rooms of Tokyo's intelligence bureau, stacks of useless transcripts whispered of a war lost not just by strength, but by understanding. Among them lay the final intercepts of the Navajo Code, reels of magnetic tape labeled in fading ink. Unknown American tribal signal. For months after surrender, Japanese cryptographers remained at their desks, reviewing the recordings one last time. They listened to the same calm voices that had haunted them across the Pacific. To e ya at e. Water is good. Nasha. I move forward. Words that sounded like wind over stone. To them, it was still a cipher. But to the Navajo, it was prayer and identity. Captain Masao Yamada, the linguist who had once studied in New Mexico, was among those ordered to brief American occupation officers after the war. When shown a map of Iwo Jima and asked how close Japan had come to deciphering the Navajo transmissions, he smiled faintly and said, "You cannot decipher a soul." Then he quietly packed his papers, burned the remaining notes, and returned to a civilian life that never felt whole again. Across the ocean, the men whose voices had undone an empire returned to silence of their own. The Navajo Code talkers came home not to parades or ceremonies, but to the quiet wind of the reservation. They resumed lives as shepherds, carpenters, farmers. They spoke of nothing. Their mission was still classified. In the small towns scattered across Arizona and New Mexico, people saw young men return wearing Marine uniforms covered in dust. They never spoke of battles, never spoke of medals. Some couldn't even tell their wives what they had done. When asked, they simply said, "We talked on the radio." The truth was locked away in vaults in Washington, sealed by government order. The world knew of Bletchley Park and the Enigma machine, but not of the men who spoke their ancestors' words through gunfire. Even among their own people, their silence grew heavy. Many struggled to find work. Some battled nightmares that came each night in the voice of static. The radio had become both weapon and ghost. Chester Nez later remembered, "Sometimes I still hear it, the clicking, the calling. It's the sound of what we did, and what we can never undo." Yet, even in silence, the code lived on. Through the early years of the Cold War, the United States quietly kept the Navajo Code active. It was never declassified, never retired. The Korean War came, and once again, Navajo voices carried secret messages through the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir. In Vietnam, decades later, echoes of that code resurfaced in training manuals. Some phrases, adapted and modernized, were still used by Marine signal units. The code, that had begun in 1942 on a scrap of paper in Camp Pendleton, conceived by 29 Navajo Marines, would survive into the Jet Age. And through it all, the Japanese transcripts sat untouched in American archives. Historians studying the war decades later would marvel at the sheer volume of the effort. Thousands of recorded intercepts, none deciphered. One analyst described it simply: "It was the only code Japan could not read, and the only one we never had to change." Meanwhile, in post-war Japan, memory became reflection. For men like Yamada and his fellow linguists, defeat brought humility and a strange kind of admiration. In his memoir, Echoes of the Pacific, Yamada wrote, "We sought patterns and machines. They sought spirit and meaning. We forgot that language is not made of logic alone, but of the life that speaks it." He would go on to teach linguistics at Kyoto University, lecturing on the limits of translation. To his students, he sometimes played fragments of old recordings, the voices of Navajo Marines, faint beneath the static of time. When asked what they were saying, he would close his eyes and answer, "They were saying what we could never understand, that the strength of a people lies not in their armies, but in their words." Recognition came late for the code talkers. In 1968, more than 2 decades after the war, the U.S. government finally declassified their mission. Newspapers called it the last great secret of the Pacific. The surviving Navajo veterans were suddenly remembered, celebrated, and honored. At the Pentagon, journalists listened in awe as old men, gray-haired and soft-spoken, demonstrated how their language had once guided entire invasions. In 2001, the United States Congress awarded the original 29 code talkers the Congressional Gold Medal. President George W. Bush, standing before the aged warriors, said, "By using their native language, these men created the only unbreakable code in modern warfare. They gave our military a chance to win, and our world a chance to live in freedom." For the Navajo, the ceremony was more than recognition. It was healing. Elder Key at City wept as he held the medal. "They tried to take our language away, but it saved America. Now they will remember our words forever." On the other side of the Pacific, in Tokyo's National Institute for Defense Studies, a small, unmarked folder still exists. Inside are 3 surviving transcripts from intercepted Navajo messages, preserved not as failure, but as testimony. A modern researcher once translated the Japanese annotations scrawled in pencil across one page. They read, "Language of the earth, language of the mountain, unknown, unbreakable." The legacy of the unbroken code is not just military. It is human. It is the story of how something once condemned became the key to victory, how a people once silenced found power through their very silence. In a world obsessed with technology, the Navajo reminded both sides of something ancient, that true encryption is not in machines, but in meaning, woven through stories, born from generations, carried in breath. When the last surviving code talkers gathered in 2022, Beneath the vast skies of Window Rock, they opened the ceremony with prayer, not for victory, but for peace. Their voices rose in rhythm, deep and resonant, echoing the same tones that once crossed the Pacific. And as the sun set over the red mesas, one elder, his uniform faded and medals glinting in the dying light, whispered into the microphone, "We spoke to save lives. Our words are not weapons anymore. They are songs again." In Japan, far from those mesas, the descendants of cryptographers and soldiers have begun to study the Navajo story in their own museums. Some leave flowers before displays of captured American radios, not as symbols of defeat, but as gestures of respect. "The Americans had their code," said one curator quietly, "but what they really had was their spirit." 80 years have passed since the first Navajo voice broke through static on Guadalcanal. The machines of war have changed: computers, satellites, quantum encryption. But the lesson remains unchanged. In the end, no algorithm can match the strength of culture, memory, and identity. For the Japanese who tried to break it, and for the Navajo who lived it, the code was more than a secret. It was proof that language, when born from the heart of a people, can shape history itself. And so the final words belong to them, the unbroken voices across oceans of time. "Ta ho agitiego," it is up to us. A promise spoken in war and kept in peace. The wind over the mesas of Arizona moves like an ancient voice, soft, low, eternal. In its rhythm, the echoes of war have long since faded. Yet somewhere within that silence, the whispers of the code talkers still live. 80 years have passed since those voices carried across the Pacific. The radios are gone, the battlefields overgrown, but the code, the living language, endures. Each year at Window Rock, the Navajo Nation gathers to remember. The ceremony is small, humble. A flag ripples in the dry wind. Beside it, the bronze figures of 2 Marines stand immortalized, headphones on, microphones in hand. Beneath them, a single inscription reads, "Their words saved a nation." Children stand in line before the monument. Some wear miniature uniforms, others hold tiny radios built from scrap. They listen to the elders speak in Navajo, the same syllables that once baffled an empire. "This," says one elder, "is what the enemy could not understand. This is who we are." Among the crowd, Japanese visitors often come. Historians, descendants, and scholars. They stand quietly, hands clasped, listening to the language that once filled their ancestors' intercepted recordings. In 2019, an elderly man named Kenji Watanabe traveled from Osaka to attend the Code Talker commemoration. His grandfather had been one of the cryptographers in Tokyo who tried to break the Navajo transmissions during the war. Carrying a small notebook, Kenji approached one of the surviving Code Talkers, Peter MacDonald. Through a translator, he spoke softly. "My grandfather worked to break your code. He failed, but he told my father that he admired it, that it was not numbers, but spirit. He said it was the first time he realized language could be holy." MacDonald, his uniform heavy with medals, nodded slowly. "He was right," he said. "Our words are sacred. We use them to heal, not to hurt. But in war, they had to save lives. Maybe now they can bring peace." The 2 men bowed to one another, an old warrior and the grandson of his wartime adversary. For a moment, the ghosts of Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima seemed to rest. Across the Pacific, in Japan's National Museum of Communication History, a small exhibit tells the story from the other side. Behind glass sits a rusted American field radio, its dials frozen at the frequencies once used by the Marines. Next to it, a faded Japanese transcript reads, "We do not understand. It sounds like wind." Visitors stop and listen to restored recordings of Navajo transmissions, calm, rhythmic voices crackling through static. Some close their eyes and imagine what it must have been like, sitting in a bunker, hearing words you could not decipher, yet knowing they carried death, precision, and mystery. a plaque beneath the recording bears a quote from Captain Masao Yamada's final lecture before his death in 1963. The Americans defeated us with technology, but the Navajo defeated us with humanity. Back in America, a different kind of preservation began. Linguists and tribal historians worked to document every word of the wartime code, not for secrecy, but for legacy. At the Navajo Language Academy, students still practice phrases like Chedagahi, tank, Beshlo, submarine, Tautwa, airplane. What were once battle commands are now lessons of pride. For many young Navajo, learning the code is a bridge to their ancestors. When I speak these words, says student Talia Bitsili, I feel them beside me, the ones who spoke them first. It's like they're still talking through us. Even now, as modern cryptography reaches the quantum age, computer scientists study the Navajo code for inspiration. Some call it the perfect example of natural encryption, a system rooted in cultural complexity that cannot be replicated by artificial means. But for the Navajo people, it is not a formula. It is a living soul. In the deserts of New Mexico, the last of the original code talkers are few. Their hands tremble, their voices faint, yet when they speak their code again for school children, time itself seems to pause. One such moment was captured in a 2021 documentary. A frail man, eyes clouded with age, held a microphone close and whispered into it, "Nasha." I move forward. His translator paused, then explained, that was the first word he spoke in training, back in 1942. It means to go on, to keep walking. It was the word that carried us through the war. The children listened in silence, and as his words echoed through the room, you could almost hear the Pacific surf, the static of a field radio, and the distant thunder of battles now long ended. Meanwhile, in Japan, a different kind of silence endures, one of reflection rather than defeat. At Kyoto University, where Yamada once taught, his old lecture notes are displayed each year during a memorial symposium. Among them is a single sentence written in both Japanese and English. Language is not merely to speak, it is to remember. His students, now scholars themselves, often visit the Navajo Nation to study the living language he once failed to understand. They come not as cryptographers, but as listeners. Some have joined community efforts to help digitize and archive Navajo oral histories, offering their expertise in preservation and sound restoration. What began as wartime opposition has transformed into cultural alliance. The story of the Navajo code talkers and their Japanese adversaries has become something greater than war. It has become a shared parable about the power of human connection. It reminds us that the same words that command destruction can also command peace, that the same voices once used in battle can later teach forgiveness. And it reminds Japan and America both that understanding is the truest form of victory. Today, as the last survivors pass into legend, their radios rest silent in museums, their code inscribed on bronze plaques and textbooks. But in classrooms across the Navajo Nation, children still speak the old words, still laugh at the way their elders used turtle for tank and potato for grenade. Their laughter, in its way, is the final victory, the sound of a language no longer feared, but loved. In the end, the story of the Unbreakable Code is not about war at all. It is about endurance, about a people whose language carried them through centuries of erasure, through battle, and into history. When the last code talker dies, the code itself will still live, because the Navajo language lives, because the world now knows that something once thought primitive was, in truth, unbreakable. Final narration, closing monologue. They called it a code, but it was never just a code. It was memory. It was identity. It was the sound of a people who refused to vanish. The Japanese could record it, analyze it, fear it, but they could never break it, because it was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be spoken. And as long as one voice still speaks it, the Navajo will never fall silent. Fade out. The wind moves again across the mesas. Somewhere, faintly, the radio crackles to life one last time. Ahi-hi. Thank you.